It's 5 a.m. on a cold and foggy morning on the 6th of September 1634. The Protestant army, mostly Germans and Swedes, stand at the foot of a hill close to the German city of Nördlingen. Everyone is waiting for the order to attack. Suddenly, the artillery breaks the silence with the cracking thunder of its bombardment. The Protestant war cry, "God with us," resounds along the entire front line. It is mirrored on the other side by the Catholic "Long live the House of Habsburg" in German, Italian, Spanish and Flemish versions. The Battle of Nördlingen has just begun. In this video, we analyze the Battle of Nördlingen with the aims of answering three questions. Firstly, what political, strategical and tactical constellation led to an immense battle of 4 different armies? Secondly, why did this battle change the course of the war and initiate the so-called French phase of the 30 Years' War? And thirdly, does this battle really justify the assertion that the Spanish Tercio formation was just as effective as the Swedish Brigades, as is commonly argued? Before we answer these questions, we want to shout out World of Warships, a must-play game for any military history enthusiast. World of Warships is also the sponsor of this video. From a historical perspective, it's cool to see that World of Warships goes beyond just being a game. It's a unique digital floating museum, displaying breathtaking recreations of not just the most fearsome vessels of the First and Second World Wars, but also the many blueprints and designs that never saw light, but that have been given life in the game's virtual dockyards. In-game, you will conquer the oceans aboard battleships, destroyers, aircraft carriers, or cruisers. Playing World of Warships is both an immersive experience and free to play on PC. So it hits right home for military history fans, and there is no entry barrier. With new content released every month, for example new ships, in-game nations, cosmetics or even ship classes, you can always count on enjoying fresh gameplay experiences in World of Warships' massive 12 vs 12 arenas. The game is also available on consoles, by the way. Start playing World of Warships now by using the first link in the description box below. During the registration, use the promo code BRAVO to get some exclusive rewards for free. In 1632, the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus, hailed as the liberator of Protestant Germany, died in the Battle of Lützen. He had intervened in the 30 Years' War in 1631 and challenged the Catholic control over large parts of Germany, most distinctly represented by the Austrian House of the Habsburgs and the Bavarians. Gustavus left only a 6-year-old daughter and a constitution that made no provision for the rule without a king. The subsequent power vacuum was filled by 10 councillors of state, who eventually confirmed Axel Oxenstierna, Gustavus's closest advisor, as Sweden's High Chancellor in Germany in January of 1633. However, Oxenstierna was not a charismatic military leader. His talent was better used as an administrator, and he knew that himself. So the question who would lead the troops into battle in Germany became paramount. At this point, there were really only 2 viable candidates, Gustav Horn and Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar. Horn was a cautious commander, who was often unable to assert himself over the other generals. In that, he differed fundamentally from Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar. The historian Peter Wilson characterizes him as follows, quote, "He was capable of sudden bold moves that disconcerted his opponents, but often ended in near disaster. He also frequently changed his mind, wasting time marching in different directions to little effect." End quote. After Gustavus's death, Bernhard insisted on being made supreme commander, but Oxenstierna rejected Bernhard's wish to combine all armies under his command. Instead, Bernhard was sent to Swabia and Franconia. Horn, who was to join Bernhard from Alsace, had a separate army under his command. The remaining Swedish forces were divided further and put in charge of several other commanders. With the army divided and matters of command secured for the moment, Oxenstierna turned his attention to the strategy table. 2 main factors needed to be considered. On the one hand, he had to secure his Protestant allies in Germany such as Saxony and Brandenburg, who might choose to agree to a separate peace with the Catholic Emperor Ferdinand II if they felt the Swedes could not protect them anymore. On the other hand, payments by their ally France needed to be secured. Catholic France had supported the Protestant Swedish war efforts for a while, because even though there were religious differences between the 2 powers, Both were interested in fighting the Habsburgs, who controlled the lands of Austria and the Spanish Empire. Cardinal Richelieu, who managed the affairs of France, had already become skeptical about the Swedish war efforts by 1632. In 1633, he even considered supporting the Germans directly and ditching the Swedes. Oxenstierna reacted quickly by calling in a congress in the city of Heilbronn, where he received strong support from the German counts and princes. As a result, the League of Heilbronn was formed, and this would eventually solve both of Oxenstierna's problems. The Germans were now following the Swedish lead, and France, who was anxious to fall between two stools if it attempted to support the Germans instead of the Swedes, continued the subsidy payments to the Swedes. For the moment, the Swedes seemed to have stabilized their position in southern and central Germany. In contrast to the Swedes, the Empire had a much more coherent command structure, at least in theory. The task of ejecting the Swedes was given to Wallenstein, the generalissimo of the Imperial forces that had fought the Swedish army at the Battle of Lützen. He had an impressive Imperial army that totaled 72,000 men in Bohemia and Silesia, with another 30,000 scattered across in garrisons across Alsace, Westphalia, around Lake Constance, and along the Danube. However, he repeatedly dismissed direct orders from the Emperor Ferdinand II to attack the Swedes. He would argue, for example, that it would be too risky to march his army in winter, and even if the Swedes were in a weak position. Wallenstein's indecisiveness might have been heavily incentivized by his personal interests. Most likely, Wallenstein favored a peace between Sweden and the Empire, because he would have benefited personally from such a peace. He would have gotten land in Bohemia, to be more specific. So his strategy hinged on persuading Saxony and Brandenburg to abandon Sweden, thereby exposing the Swedish bridgehead in the Baltic, a vital access point for troops and supplies, and isolating Swedish bases elsewhere, and thereby, finally, forcing them into a peace. However, Wallenstein's exact aims cannot be known because his correspondence was contradictory and inconsistent. For example, he told the Swedes they could get Pomerania in exchange for a general peace, but at the same time the Swedes intercepted his letter to the Duke of Lorraine in October of 1633, which suggested that Wallenstein intended to exclude them from Germany altogether. Ultimately, his inactivity and contradictory communication led to him losing the favor of the Catholics, first and foremost the one of Emperor Ferdinand II. In February of 1634, he was assassinated by the Imperials. With Wallenstein out of the way, the overall command structure was now more effective. At this point in time, one more Ferdinand entered the stage. It was Archduke Ferdinand, not the Emperor Ferdinand II himself, but his son, who took over general command from Wallenstein. The Swedes, meanwhile, still operated in many different armies throughout Germany. Bernhard was still in Franconia, and Horn was besieging Überlingen in an attempt to close the Lake Constance route for any Spanish troops seeking to reinforce the Austrian Habsburgs in Germany or moving north towards the Netherlands, a Protestant ally of Sweden. There, the Netherlands and Spain were fighting their own war, the 80 Years' War, parallel to the 30 Years' War. In order to bring men and material to the Netherlands, the Spanish relied on a system of roads from Italy to the Netherlands, collectively referred to as the Spanish Road. It really was the only way to consistently bring reinforcements to the Netherlands because the sea route proved way too risky, with French, sometimes English and also Dutch ships attacking them along the way. To make matters worse, France had invaded and occupied Spanish territory in Lorraine in 1633, which further limited the Spanish road to the Netherlands. So, by 1633, Spain's main objective was to reopen the Spanish road. With the Swedes and French blocking any attempt of Catholic forces to move up to the Netherlands, Spain got drawn into the conflict in Germany as well. Consequently, they moved up troops from Milan, which was under Spanish control at the time. Here, yet another Ferdinand enters the stage. Confusingly, he is called Ferdinand of Austria, but he was the son of the previous Spanish king Philip III and brother of the current Spanish king Philip IV. Being the son of a king in Spain means your title in Spanish is infante, which translates to prince. But Ferdinand was also Archbishop of Toledo, and became cardinal in 1619, which is why he is referred to as Cardinal Infante. So, the situation right before the Battle of Nördlingen was tense. 3 different Catholic armies were attacking the Swedes in southern Germany. Spanish forces under the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand were moving in from the south. Bavarian and Imperial forces used the space created by the separation of the 2 Swedish main armies under Horn and Bernhard to attack Regensburg, which the Swedes tried to prevent without success. To make matters worse for the Swedes, Archduke Ferdinand moved more Imperial forces to besiege the city of Nördlingen in Franconia in August. This movement into Franconia struck the heart of the Heilbronn League. Oxenstierna struggled to maintain the dwindling support at the League's second Congress, which was currently meeting in Frankfurt. Nördlingen had little strategic value, but Oxenstierna could not afford to lose it, because the League might take it as a sign of weakness and seek peace with the Catholics, which would endanger the Swedish position in Germany and might lead to France stopping their subsidy payments to Sweden. Oxenstierna had only one option left. He directed all available forces to relieve Nördlingen. Now Horn and Bernhard had to act. They reunited at Ulm and then moved east through Aalen to Bopfingen. Nördlingen was under immense pressure. They knew they had to act if they wanted to relieve it, but at the same time they still expected further reinforcements by Oxenstierna to arrive soon. Bernhard pressed to attack directly, but Horn cautiously refused to cross the river, so close to the enemy. They had only a sketchy idea of the terrain beyond the river, because the Imperial Croats and Dragoons prevented effective reconnaissance. The full strength of the enemy forces wasn't fully known either. In the end, they decided to march west, as if retreating to Ulm, but then headed south to seize a line of hills 2 kilometers south of Nördlingen to outflank the 2 Ferdinands and wait for reinforcements sent by Oxenstierna. This way, they would have a superior position, might successfully distract the enemy from continuing the siege, and could establish a defensive position that would allow for both reinforcements and supplies to be sent to them. On the 5th of September, they set off at 5 am and marched south towards Neresheim, where they left their baggage and headed east across the wooded Jura hills. The vanguard was led by Bernhard, who was spotted by the Imperial scouts around 4 pm. The 2 Catholic commanders, Leganes and Gallas, reacted immediately and secured the line of hills to their left with a couple hundred of musketeers. This chain of hills ran northwest to southeast from the river Ega and was separated by the Jura hills by the marshy Retzenbach stream. The Swedish troops appeared near the Himmelreich hill in the west shortly after 4 pm, where the first skirmishes with the Catholic troops took place. Over time, the skirmishes developed into a larger and more extensive struggle, as both sides committed more and more men. Bernhard pushed forward. He knew he had to seize the high ground if the Swedes wanted to have any chance of relieving Nördlingen. He slowly pressed forward, but was constantly engaged by Imperial cavalry, to which he responded with his own horsemen. Allegedly, more than 6,000 horsemen were engaging each other at some point during that fight. Bernhard's troops still felt the march across the Jura and the Retzenbach River in their legs, but after 3 hours he had taken the Himmelreich, the wooded Ländle and the open lower Lachberg in quick succession. In the meantime, however, the Spaniards had reacted, analyzed the terrain and now also understood that the high ground was crucial. They knew that the next 2 hills, the Heselberg and the Albuch, would be of utmost importance in preventing the Swedes from outflanking the Catholic position at Nördlingen. Consequently, they sent Sergeant Major Escobar with further reinforcements to the Heselberg. At around 6:30 pm, the Protestant army attacked again. While they were advancing on the Heselberg, they were constantly harassed by Escobar's musketeers and arquebusiers, probably by something akin to platoon fire, which meant that small groups of musketeers fired together. This allowed for a continuous hail of bullets, which discouraged any Swede to stick his head too far out of cover. This must have been effective, because Bernhard settled for a continuous barrage of the Heselberg by his artillery for the time being. In this manner, he was waiting for Horn, who finally arrived well after nightfall. Meanwhile, Escobar received further reinforcements and the Cardinal Infante ordered him to defend the Hazelberg until death. Multiple assaults followed, and only when the Spaniards started to run out of ammunition did they finally give ground and retreat to the next hill, the Albuch. In the confusion of battle, however, Escobar had been taken prisoner. He was brought to Bernard and Horn's tent, where he was questioned. Bernard wanted to know how many men were stationed on the Albuch hill, and threatened to hang Escobar if he wasn't going to tell the truth. So Escobar did. He told him truthfully there were 15,000 infantry and 3,500 horsemen. But Bernard, rather foolishly, did not believe him. He got angry and had Escobar removed from the tent. To make matters worse, and at that moment in time unbeknownst to the Swedes, the Spanish had reinforced the position on the Albuch hill already with 3 individual defensive positions, about 14 cannons, and, even more importantly, all these men spent the entire night digging trenches. The Albuch was the last obstacle that kept the Swedes from outflanking the 2 Ferdinands. So, at midnight of the 5th of September, only one thing was crystal clear to everybody. If the Swedes don't take the Albuch hill, they will not win the battle. On the morning of the 6th of September, both armies were ready for battle. The Swedes occupied the hills from the Ländle to the Hazelberg. The Spanish had anchored the left flank on the Albuch, while the rest of their troops were positioned along a straight line running north towards Nördlingen. General Leganes had the left, Gallas the right, where he took position behind the village of Herkheim, with its large, flat plain to the east. The Duke of Lorraine was in command of the middle section, and the Italian Serbelloni took immediate control of the German and Italian forces in service of the Spanish crown on the Albuch hill. All in all, there were about 35,000 men under Catholic command. On the other side, Horn had the Swedish right and Bernard the left. In total, they had brought around 26,000 men to the battlefield. The peace and quiet of the night was interrupted suddenly and loudly at 5 a.m. when the Swedish cannons opened up on the hilltop of the Albuch. Their kind morning greeting was returned just as warmly by the Catholic batteries along the entire front line. Meanwhile, the Swedish frontline infantry, the Pfuhl and Scots Brigade, approached the Albuch hill head-on, while 3 cavalry squadrons under Colonel Witzleben started an outflanking maneuver intending to go around the Albuch. Things got messy very quickly for the Swedes. Both infantry battalions came under heavy fire from the 14 cannons at the ridge of the hill, and the cavalry found itself soon under heavy crossfire from the southernmost fortification on the Albuch hill. As if that had not been enough, just when the Swedes started their charge on the Catholic trench line, they were countercharged by the Catholic cavalry from the flank. The Catholic cavalry shattered one of the Swedish squadrons almost immediately and forced all of them to retreat. This left the 2 Swedish infantry battalions, who were making a concentric movement towards the central redoubt without any flank protection. Despite this, they both managed to get into the thick of a dense and bloody melee, about which we don't have any reliable details besides the fact that the Swedes came out on top. The Imperial infantry fled and the Swedes carried the hill in their first rush. Things were finally looking up. The other 2 redoubts, however, were still intact. Only the center had given way. While the Swedes tried to bring more men there and capitalize on this early victory, the experienced Spanish Tercio Idiaquez, which was held in reserve further back on the Albuch, rallied the fleeing Imperial troops and killed those who refused to return and fight. Together with the cavalry on their right and the regrouped Germans, the Spanish Tercio pushed toward the Swedish position. It must have been clear to any Catholic commander that losing the central redoubt would be disastrous for the remaining battle, so they were probably very eager to take it back. However, we don't know much about the unfolding fight besides the result, which was that the Protestants had to retreat and the Catholics reoccupied the redoubt. The Protestants later declared a powder magazine exploded and drove them out, but the Catholic sources disagree with that assessment. In any case, The Pfuhl and Scots Brigade retreated in order, although with heavy casualties, while the 2nd Infantry line of the Swedes was ordered to advance on the northernmost redoubt. This position was held by the Tercio of Toralto, which consisted mostly of Italians. Because their redoubt was too small to accommodate all men, they were stationed in the open in a defensive formation. It's important to note that a tercio at this point in time was more of an administrative unit than a battle formation. The men themselves did not fight in one big square, but in so-called escuadrones, which were very similar to battalions. Just like the tercio, they had detachments of musketeers, so-called mangas, which could be detached and operated on their own if need be. Still, these were proper pike and shot formations, and consequently, little bastions of pikes and musket fire. The Catholics greeted the Swedish cavalry with a mouthful of lead, and a prolonged fight ensued. According to various primary sources, the Swedish cavalry really gave their best and repeatedly charged the Catholic infantry under heavy losses, but their experienced opponents simply stood their ground and the Swedish horsemen were forced to fall back. The Swedish assault was left in the hands of the infantry, who engaged in an intense musketry duel with the Catholics, approximately 50 steps away from each other. At the same time, the remaining Swedish cavalry attacked the central redoubt for a second time and again drove out the Imperials holding the position, which killed both German commanders of the section. Just as the first time around, the Spaniards of the Idiaquez Tercio, who were still held in reserve, killed anyone who refused to stay their ground. Once more, the Elbe Hill was within grasp of the Swedes. The central redoubt was taken and the northernmost position could be charged by a line of infantry at any moment, as they were only 50 steps away from the trench line. The only option for the men of the Idiaquez Tercio was to counterattack. They moved slowly and in order down the hill, taking heavy casualties from the guns of the central redoubt that the Swedes had already turned around. But discipline prevailed, and eventually they reached the Protestants. What followed was another bloody hand-to-hand fight which saw pikes clash and muskets being used as clubs. Hundreds of men lost their lives. After more than an hour of fighting, the Spaniards pushed the Swedes out and took the position back. However, the day was not over yet. Horn ordered the Pfuhl and Scots Brigade to attack again, while the other infantry brigade fell back and rested. Several infantry assaults followed over the course of the next hours. While they did inflict casualties, they did not manage to break through. Horn realized that a frontal assault would not lead to any progress, so he ordered his cavalry to outflank the Elbuch between the Elbuch and the Schönfeld. But as they tried to thrust into the potential gap, they were stopped by an Imperial countercharge, and the Catholic musketeers on the hill managed to come in range and fire down on the Swedes. This forced them to retreat under heavy losses, yet again. Around 7:30 am, Horn had sent a messenger to Bernard asking for help. Bernard, who knew they had to take the Elbuch no matter the cost, sent 2 additional brigades to support Horn, the Black and Yellow Brigades led by Thurn. Bernard planned to launch an assault with the rest of the troops to distract the Catholics from sending reinforcements to the Elbuch. But the Catholics knew exactly that the tactical options of the Swedes were limited, and consequently had already further reinforced the Elbuch position and even ordered another tercio from the Schönfeld to march to the foot of the Haselberg, with orders to shoot at anything that moved. Around 7:45 am, Thurn moved along the Haselberg and came in sight of the Toralto tercio at the northernmost redoubt. Without informing Horn and without any cavalry support, he attacked with both his brigades. Horn saw the disaster unfolding from his command post and sent the cavalry reserves to rescue the situation. On the other side, only after Thurn was moving at the Haselberg at around 8 am, Bernard's cavalry started moving against the Imperial Bavarian flank near the village of Herkheim. More than 2,000 horsemen rode down from the Lachberg and engaged the Catholics on the plain in front of Herkheim. A prolonged fight ensued in which the Catholics slowly gained the upper hand. Bernard sent in his cavalry reserve bit by bit to rescue his losing first wave, but this helped only little. Meanwhile, Horn's cavalry advanced between the Albuch and the Schönfeld to cover Thurn, who was still moving against the northernmost redoubt without any backup. The Catholics did not remain idle, and again countercharged and handily beat the Swedes back. Thurn's men were now without any cavalry support. They were sitting ducks and had to hold out for more than 1 hour while being threatened on their flank by crossfire and constantly shot at from the Albuch. Eventually, the Spanish, emboldened by the Swedes' precarious position, moved out of their fortified redoubt and charged the Swedes. This finally forced them to retreat to the Haselberg tree line. The cavalry fight on the plain in front of Herkheim was still going on when Horn accepted that the Albuch hill would not give in. He wrote to Bernard to discuss how they should proceed, and he arrived just when Bernard's last cavalry squadrons were rolling down the hill to support the cavalry on the field. Horn suggested an orderly retreat, which would mean they could fight another day. However, a retreat would also endanger the alliance with the various German states, and even with France, because the Swedes would look weak. After a long discussion in which Bernard repeatedly refused to retreat, he finally consented. However, he insisted that his men would hold the Ländle and the Lachberg, while Horn's men should retreat along the valley towards Ederheim, where they were supposed to fortify a position to cover the rest of the retreating troops. While Horn slowly started to retreat, the Catholics noted that the Swedish advance was ineffective and sent forward the Imperial Weber Brigade, who was positioned just below the Haselberg. Likewise, the Spanish-Italian Tercios Doralto and Guasco came ever closer to the Haselberg position, probably encouraged by their earlier victories, or maybe out of sheer audacity, the Catholics assaulted the Haselberg position. Several cavalry squadrons were ordered to outflank the position to the right, and more infantry was committed to the assault. The Catholics attacked the Haselberg from all sides simultaneously and carried the hill in their first rush. By now, Bernard's cavalry, which had been fighting near Herkheim, had retreated back to the Lachberg and Ländle position. The Catholics now held 2 of the important hills and controlled the entire plain between Herkheim and the Swedish line. Gallas, the commander on the right wing, was informed of the success of the Haselberg and decided that the time had come for a general assault on the entire right wing of Bernard's position. Meanwhile, Horn moved his men along the intended route to retreat. Just when his column reached Ederheim, Bernard's entire flank, still exhausted from the fight on the plain, was attacked frontally by the Catholics. The fight was bloody and short. Bernard's entire flank collapsed, and his men took to flight in all directions. While Bernard himself managed to flee, poor Horn was cramped in with his long column and had to watch in horror as the Catholic tide ascended from the woods and hills above him. It was a total defeat. The Swedish casualties came in around 12,000 to 15,000 men, of which around 7,000 to 8,000 were dead. The rest was wounded or taken prisoner, including Horn. The Catholics recorded only about 3,500 to 5,000 casualties, with 1,500 to 2,000 dead. But the numbers, while clearly indicating a Catholic victory, are somewhat deceiving. The Swedish losses de facto meant that the Swedish army almost ceased to exist. Bernard only managed to bring around 14,000 men to Heilbronn, where it became clear to Oxenstierna how bad the situation really was. Sweden lost most of its important supporters in Germany. The Imperial army retook most of the Duchy of Württemberg and moved into the Rhineland. By December, both Saxony and Hesse-Darmstadt negotiated a peace agreement with the Emperor Ferdinand, later formalized in the Treaty of Prague. Many historians, like Geoffrey Parker, see in this treaty the moment when the 30 Years' War ceased to be primarily a German religious conflict. Many historians also point out that this battle proved that the Tercio was still a force to be reckoned with. However, this has to be taken with a grain of salt. While the Spanish forces were tactically on equal footing with the Swedes, this was because they themselves reformed their tactical organization. The Tercio itself while still being an administrative as well as a tactical unit, was further divided in mangas and escuadrones by 1622. In addition, the Swedes assaulted a reinforced Spanish position on a high ground, so based on the Battle of Nördlingen, it cannot be asserted which formation was tactically superior. Neither was Nördlingen a proper pitched battle on equal terms, nor was the Tercio an outmoded military unit to begin with. In any case, the anti-Habsburg alliance in Germany collapsed and the French saw themselves forced to take matters in their own hands. In February of 1635, Cardinal Richelieu signed a treaty agreeing to a joint Franco-Dutch offensive in the Spanish Netherlands, while a French army under Henry of Rohan would cut the Spanish road by invading the Valtellina. In the same year, they formed a new alliance with Sweden, and they financed an army of 12,000 under Bernard of Saxe-Weimar in the Rhineland. In May, France formally declared war on Spain, starting both the French phase of the 30 Years' War and the Franco-Spanish War.